3, 2, 1. Hello everyone, welcome to the China Experience Show. Today my guest is Manya Koetse. She's the founder and editor of What's on Weibo. She is an MPhil graduate in Asian Studies, specialized in Chinese language and culture and Japanese language and culture. In her articles and academic work, she focuses on digital trends and social media in China, popular culture, and gender issues. Welcome, Manya. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, I love your website. I usually use your website to get news, to go out to know what's happening in China. So you're pretty much like a direct source of information for me, and I guess lots of others in China. So, tell me a bit about yourself. You studied Japanese and Chinese as well. What brought you to Asia in general? Yeah.
Oh God, what brought me to Asia in general? I think ever since I was very young, when I was 12, 13, 11 maybe even, I already started reading a lot about China. So I'm originally from Holland, and in the 1990s there was this big boom of Chinese literature. A lot of different books. I think it was a sort of a China craze in Europe at the time. So already I read books at the time about China, but much later I had an opportunity to go to Japan as an exchange student. So my first experience in Asia were in Japan, but later when I also started studying Japanese at Leiden University, I noticed a lot of friends of mine were studying Chinese, and I thought it was actually more exciting. So I kind of came back to my first love, where it all started.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how was your experience like in Japan? Because I used to live in Japan as well, but not as an exchange student, more after finishing university. I was just there about 2 years or so. I was there for studying Japanese for about 6 months, and I found a job teaching because I was poor. I needed money. And then afterwards I decided I want to explore a bit more of Asia, see what's like in China, and here I am. What about you?
For me, Japan was a very, very tough year because I was only 16. I didn't know any Japanese when I arrived, and I studied there for a year, living with a Japanese host family, going to a Japanese school, no other foreigners there. So for me, it was really, really a big challenge, but I think it also taught me later on not to be afraid, for example, to take on Chinese, because I thought, okay, I could do it maybe a second time to start to find an entrance into this big culture that is so unknown to me. So for me, it has taught me that you can actually find an entrance and start to really understand a culture that's very different from yours.
Yeah, I can imagine it must have been like a huge culture shock, especially at 16, like you mentioned. And especially in Japan, where like in Japanese schools, it must have been like very popular for everyone in the class and the school, definitely, right?
Yes, but I must also admit, so at the one hand, you're very popular because you're the foreigner, but on the other hand, you're also very lonely because people don't really grant you access to their closest groups of friends. And I found that to be very, very different in China. So in Japan, I felt that people were always very polite, but actually very closed off. And in China, I first lived for a time in Shanghai and later in Beijing. Especially in Shanghai, people could be quite rude sometimes. But once you get through that, then you find out that they're actually very welcoming. And to put it in a very crude way, I sometimes said later that I felt that sometimes Japanese people can be very warm on the outside, but a little bit cold inside, and it goes the opposite way for Chinese.
Yeah, I have to agree, not to say anything bad about Japan, of course. I love Japan, and I'm a big fan of their work and culture, but actually living there, I saw exactly what you were talking about. It's very difficult to be considered an insider or to assimilate into their culture, not into their culture, but even to make friends, and to be seen as anything other than maybe the foreigner. In some circles, right? I'm not making a generalization for everyone, but it seems to be a common experience and a common observation between lots of people who go to Japan for a long time.
Yeah.
And for me, what brought me to China especially was the work environment, because in Japan, you're expected to, at least where I was working at it, you're expected to live for the job, and be there all the time. And I had some colleagues who would even come on their days off to work there, so it didn't make too much sense. And China, in that aspect, is a lot better. There's a lot more freedom to explore things professionally and so on. So how do you see that reflected in your work on What's on Weibo? What made you decide to start the site?
I think because, I've been living in China for about 2 years, starting from the Olympics, and then later I had to go back to Leiden University to finish my degree. And when I was back in Holland, I felt that I no longer had access to that culture, to the everyday trends. Like when I was living here, I had, every day you could pick up on little stories that people were talking about. The bike shop that I always put my bike away, people on the subway. So when I was back home, I was like, okay, how do I pick up on those daily trends? And then, of course, social media was for me the major key to see what people were talking about. And I wanted to understand this major world that was really growing significantly at the time as well. And I think I got in at the right time. Yeah.
And what is the difference, in your opinion, between because a lot of people describe Weibo as being a microblog similar to Twitter or Facebook. It's got like a similar character limit, right? What do you think is difference between the atmosphere in China on Weibo versus what's in the West?
So you mean the difference between Weibo and, for example, Facebook or Twitter?
Yeah.
I think in the beginning when Weibo started, Weibo started in 2009, it was actually a little bit of a copy of Twitter, and it was also, a lot of people always called it the Chinese Twitter. But over the years, as it grew, it really transformed as a platform. And right now, still a lot of people in Europe don't know what Weibo actually is. And I try to explain it as some sort of combined platform of being a Twitter, a YouTube, a Facebook, and an Instagram, a Goodreads, and an IMDb all in one. It's such a multifunctional platform. So you have that, and then also Weibo is very event-based. So more than Twitter or Facebook, where discussions are very fragmented, I feel that you really see that every day there's a different event that a lot of people are talking about, and therefore it makes it a very interesting website for me. People are very eager to give their opinion.
And you read it in Chinese, right?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that Weibo, for being focused mainly in just one country, well, of course, China has a huge population, right? Weibo, here are some statistics. It says Sino Weibo has more than 500 million registered users.
Oh yeah, I should update that article. It's now, it could be, it's still more than, but the monthly active users are different. I think right now there are 340 million monthly active users. And it's become bigger in terms of active users than Twitter now.
Considering that there are about 38.4% of the population in China uses the internet, having this many users, registered users on Weibo is huge, right?
It is huge.
So it has a huge influence on not just society, but a host of other factors, right? How do you see that influence changing people's perceptions of things in daily life?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what you could see is that online and offline life are mixing more and more. I think, by the way, right now there are more, the online population of China is bigger than what you just mentioned, because now there's more than 770 million people online.
Yeah, 772 million at the end of 2017.
Yeah.
According to a report published by the China Internet Network Information Center.
Yeah, so it's huge. And what you see, not just in Weibo, but also in Didi or in Weixin, of course, in WeChat, online and offline life are overlapping all the time. And what is interesting for Weibo as a platform is there's a lot of different actors on there. So with actors, I mean, like, you have, of course, the general netizens, but you have the media, you have the government, you have foreign embassies, you have local police stations. So it's also very effective. It's become a real important tool for various actors to communicate. And it allows this communication, which I find most interesting, between, for example, government institutions and netizens who can directly communicate, whereas before this could never happen because media was always one-dimensional.
In between.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Then what about the impact of the government using Weibo to kind of affect or spread the news or influence the user base? One of the things that caught my attention, I think has been gaining popularity in the West, is China's supposed social credit system, right? And how that is being interpreted online on Weibo and through different media platforms is very different in China than from the West, right? Can you tell us a bit about what the social credit system is and the differences between the various systems available that do similar jobs, and just give us a rundown for those who don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think first there's a lot of confusion when you look at Western press about the social credit system. Because a lot of Western media are saying there's one social credit system, and they say it's this Black Mirror-like catastrophe, and a lot of myths going around. But actually, there's two things that people are conflating, which is the social credit system, or it's more an idea or a policy set up by the government, which is now being implemented across various regions in the country. And then you have the commercial credit systems, for example, the Sesame Credit by Alibaba, that gives people a score. The social credit systems, there's actually not one system in place, don't give people scores. They do have punitive measures. If you do something wrong, you're blacklisted, you violate certain laws. A Sesame Credit doesn't do that. Sesame Credit just awards you when you have good scores, when you pay off your bills, when you behave in a good way on their platforms. So they're two different systems.
Right.
But they're all on Weibo as well.
Yeah.
So, for example, the Hangzhou social credit system, or whatever you want to call it, is on Weibo as well, informing citizens about their recent implementations. So it's really cool because you have this communication. It's not this dark, far away something that that this idea is created in a lot of Western media.
But that's the thing, though, the fact that they're connected on Weibo, even though maybe, for example, Sesame Credit isn't so negative as people describe it. The information, let's say you have a bad credit score on Sesame Credit, that information can kind of leak towards other systems, like what we have here, the Trust Alliance or the blacklist system. So you have to make it clear to our listeners, our viewers, there's like the 2020 system, which is the government's goal to expand national social credit system, right? That's the overall one that's not that's implemented in some various places, but not completely.
Yeah.
Then you have a blacklist system, which is depending on certain crimes you do, right, or like credit crimes, you're put on a blacklist, so you can't travel based on that, or you're not allowed to use certain services.
Yeah.
You have Sesame Credit, which is Alibaba's system, like you said, and then you have the Trust Alliance, which is another similar system. But if one of these users goes afoul of one of these systems, there's a risk that it will spread to the other systems, right?
It's a little bit unclear how it works. What is very clear is the blacklist system is part actually of the social credit system. And perhaps to make it less confusing, what you could say is that China in general is going towards a more credit-based society. And whether it is with your social media, with your e-commerce, or with the way you behave in your city, it's all becoming more credit-based to work on this trustworthy society. Of course, that's the whole thing. The thing is with these blacklists, which are part of the social credit system, these are publicly available. You can just, I want to say Google them, but you can Baidu them. And anybody has access to that. So that means that also these commercial credit systems, such as Alibaba, they also have this information available. That's available to anyone. And that's why now you get problems such as private institutions saying, that was a story I wrote the other day, saying, oh, well, we cannot accept this student because his dad is on a blacklist. So it's also generating new controversies and ethical questions.
Yeah, so the story you mentioned here, for those who don't know, is on what's on Weibo. It's called Can't Enter Uni Because of Daddy's Bad Social Credits. The blacklist story that's got Weibo talking, and it basically is the story of a Chinese student who got admitted to a renowned university and was denied access because of his father's bad social credits. So what happened here, basically? It was the father... The young man's father, named Mr. Rao, ended up with bad credit, standing after owing a debt of 200,000 RMB, which is around $30,000. To a local bank for more than 2 years. Since Rao did not succeed in paying off his debt after warnings were given, he was informed by his local court that he ended up on a so-called loose trust list or blacklist, right? So that's what we're talking
That's
about.
the blacklist, yeah. So actually he had violated a court order. The court had ordered him to pay off his debt. The bank had sued him. And so then you end up, they warned him beforehand. He ended up on this blacklist. And then it is a little bit unclear because the media who have been reporting on this, they do not mention which university or institution this is about.
Yeah.
And if it would be a Beida or a Tsinghua, it would be very controversial and very, very strange. It could be a private institution maybe, but if it's the father who pays for the school fee, then that could explain why. But anyway, it's also a very effective measure because right now the latest news says that Rao has actually paid off his debts, and we don't know if his son has now been admitted, yes or no. But I think the question in this issue was also, should family members be affected by one person's social credit listing? And you see that some private schools for children, for example, now also will not allow children if one of their parents is on a blacklist for younger children as well.
Yeah, I think that's the main issue that people are, especially on Weibo, they're arguing whether, on the one hand, it is an effective way in some cases to pay off those debts, but on the other, it's a bit of like arm twisting involved by these groups, these systems, which now have more power because the information is public, is available online, and they can kind of just search and see whether you have this hanging over you, right? So, just what is the perception from within Weibo? Like, what are the users saying? Do you think it's more balanced against the system or for it? Like, especially in this case about the university.
Well, in this case, it was not about people being against the credit system, but about people finding it unfair that the son was victimized by his father's actions. But what I've seen in general about the credit system on Chinese social media is that people are very supportive of it. I mean, when it comes to the commercial systems, it's like loyalty programs. It's enjoyable because they can get things for free. Like you can get the Mobikes or the Hello Bikes. You can ride them for free, or you can get an umbrella for free when it rains. So these are just the perks. And the other one with the punishments, you notice that a lot of people say, well, this is just karma. This is just how it works. You have to behave in society. And this is building on a more harmonious society. So it's good for the collective that some individuals get punished through this system. Yeah.
But then it kind of sounds to me like a replacement to the actual legal system. Like, why not just actually enforce the laws as they should be through police and through the legal system, rather than implementing a kind of arbitrary, in some cases, rule set that has broad implications for people like the student who was affected.
But it is a way of enforcing, but it's also a way of, because let's not forget, it's not just about individuals, it's also about companies, and especially in China, where 2 years ago I have the feeling that 2016 was the year of corporate justice, that a lot of people on Chinese social media were very angry with, a lot of companies. So there's a lot of mistrust, especially when it's about food safety, for example, traffic safety, many other things. So also to have companies on this blacklist and to say you have to change this or that, or you have to before you can get off. It's a sort of more open society in a way as well. It's just another way to look at it.
Yeah, I think for Westerners though, like at least in my opinion, what worries me is that there's this big centralization of data, right? And not only centralization of data, but it's being spread among these organizations, like we talked about before. And that's not where it's going to end, right? It's going to be built upon and improved in iterations, right?
Definitely.
Like now what we have in some cities, I think in Hangzhou or in Shenzhen, the government experimenting with having face scanning technology.
Yeah.
So in case you jaywalk on the streets, they'll have certain cameras that scan your face, and it's not immediate, like it won't know who you are immediately, but over time they'll put your face and your information on a billboard saying this person jaywalked, and kind of like shaming the person not to do it again, right? And that has an influence on its surroundings, like in the local society. But what about when that becomes implemented across China, right? Throughout China and in different areas? It seems to me like it's slightly oppressive in a way. Like, what do you think about it?
Well, when the time comes, so I'm not really an opinion maker in that sense. It's more like I'm reporting what's going on. When the time comes, we'll see. For now, it's not that far along yet. But I also want to note that there are systems in, for example, the US or Europe as well that do not get so much media attention. For example, if you talk about a US blacklist of sex offenders where also people who urinated in public are on that list and whose neighbors can see, oh my God, my neighbor is a sex offender. People have to carry this label along. That's a blacklist, this one. It's publicly available. So there are systems in place in countries like the US already that are similar in some ways. So I don't know. Let time tell what direction this is going. But yeah, for sure, it's a hot topic, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
And why do you think that the Western media gets it so wrong? Like, why are they conflating certain systems? Why don't they get the bigger picture or even the details?
Well, first of all, I think when it comes to news in general, but especially China news, because things are going so fast, a lot of media companies are very pressured to be the first to get something out. You need time to research this. I mean, this is really, it is kind of tough, some of the things and the documents. And so, and a lot of people just don't have the time. And when one renowned publisher or media outlet writes something, then a lot of people take that over. Actually, I notice with What's on Weibo as well, sometimes if I write something, then it will spread to other media outlets as well. And I sometimes think, it's kind of dangerous. People should always do their own research.
Yeah, there's I think the barrier is the language most of all, right? Because maybe they don't have the staff capable of interpreting or translating the language as accurately as possible. And, it takes time. And like I said, it's not just China moving so fast. It's the world news system, is based on getting the next story out, pushing out the next story.
And a lot of clickbait.
Clickbait,
yeah.
Especially.
Because actually, even without the language barrier, so much of these texts you can find on Chinese government websites in English. So there is a lot of information available in English already. It's just that it's kind of dry.
That's right.
And it's not the story that people will click on. So what people will click on is if you talk more about the Orwellian system and the Black Mirror-like and 1980, 84. So, yeah.
So you mentioned before, just to kind of wrap up that small topic, that in China, most people don't see it as so Orwellian or Black Mirror-ish. Why, based on what you've researched, what is that? Can you explain a bit more why that is, and why people think that way, and they believe it's more of a way to keep the harmony instead of how we see in the West, that the economy believes?
Of course, I'm not suggesting that I'm the expert in this, that I know, but what I can think of is that when I observe how people talk and Chinese culture in general, it's more based on what is good for the collective and not necessarily what is good for the individual. Also in the use of social media and a lot of different ways. In Europe and America, for example, it's very individual. What are your individual privacy needs? What do you individually want? And here, well, one thing is that if the social credit system gets more sophisticated, it's far more easier to get the how do you say that in English? The bad seeds out of the
the information.
Yeah. So that's why I understand that for a lot of people it's harmonious. And let's not forget it's being sold that way to them as well through state media. That's the story that is presented to them. And they don't get that story in general for the readers who are not reading these English language news websites, but who just go by state media. That's the story that's been served. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with what you mentioned before. I hadn't thought about it that way, like the angle focusing on business compliance, right? Like we're passing the 10-year anniversary of the milk scandal, like that happened 2008, 2009 in China,
that was
right?
2008, I think, yeah.
And then it's happened not just once, but maybe 2 times, I believe. And the people are still, there's a large amount of people who are still a bit wary about milk companies because of that. And who knows, maybe like this kind of system could help in that regard in the future.
Yeah.
Let's move on to another topic that you covered on What's on Weibo. It's about spinster stereotypes and gender issues and gender roles in China. Let's start off with like the case of the 47-year-old actress Fei Yu. Did I pronounce it properly?
I think so, Fei Yu. Well, that's her English name, so it's fine, yeah.
So tell us about what happened there, like what was the issue and what was going on?
Well, Fei Yu is a popular actress, and over the past few years, she's had various interviews with some Chinese hosts on popular talk shows. And you have a lot of these clips of these male hosts asking her, why you're still single, why you're not married, what is this? And she responds to it in a very relaxed way, saying marriage is not for her, she enjoys the life she leads, she doesn't feel that pressure to get married. And I think these clips recently just blew up. You know, when something goes viral, it's just one person who posts it, who has a lot of audience, a lot of followers, and then boom, there it goes. But I think it's because a lot of women, really enjoy the way she talks about that, because they do feel this pressure, and especially because she's such a talented, beautiful, successful 47-year-old.
Yeah.
That's for them a great role model to say, hey, you can choose your own way. And I noticed over the past, this week, What's on Weibo is celebrating its 4th birthday.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. But I noticed over the past few years, like every few other months, you will have topics like this blowing up, whether it's about leftover women or about leftover men or about spinster stereotypes, or every time something different. But gender is such a huge issue. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think she touched on a nerve. She definitely touched on a nerve with this case. The thing that's interesting about Weibo is that it gives, like you were saying before, it gives people a way to vent. Not just individually, but as a group, right? Like saying, oh yeah, I also think that, and this happened to me as well. Similar to the Me Too movement, it hasn't gained as much traction here in China, I believe. But we'll go back to that a bit later. But in this case, I think a lot of people are finally able to, as a group, challenge the kind of traditional narrative that you should marry at a certain age in China, which in China is a bit younger than, it's all over the world, right? People say you should marry when you're around your 30s, 25.
Yeah.
But here in China, if you're not married by your 30, I believe, you're seen as what's called a leftover woman.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So can you explain a bit about that phenomenon to people who don't know too much about it? Like, what is a leftover woman, and why is it becoming such a hot topic?
Yeah. Well, for anyone interested, my friend Roseanne Lake, she just wrote a very nice book about this. About the leftover women and how they are changing China today. Because actually, what is so difficult about this problem is that on the one hand, because you have now this generation of one-child females who've been really pampered by their parents, but also encouraged to, take their degree and keep on studying, and they become these independent women, but then they're still on the other hand, expected to be that traditional woman who gets married. And but leftover women in general, it's actually a little bit more complicated. It's because in urban areas, there's not enough compatible men for them to marry. And then in the rural areas, you have the leftover men who find no compatible women to marry for them. So there's two sides of the social ladder.
So it's tied into the urbanization phenomena in China. Like, so a lot of people moving out of rural centers into the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities like Beijing, Tianjin, and so on.
Yeah, but the roots of the problem are, of course, that the one-child policy and the fact that there are more men than women in China. And the women that you do have are more, a great deal of them are higher educated and want a man who is also higher educated, whereas the guys stuck there in the rural areas, they do not want that. It doesn't match up.
Yeah. The way I've had it described was the problem with these leftover women is that they become more higher educated, right? And because of that higher education, they tend to move towards higher tier cities. And they have, they're called, what's called here, let's have a look, the 3 highs, right? So high income, high education, and high IQ, right? Whereas the leftover men are described as having the 3 lows, right? So low income, low education, and low IQ. So, how do you see that trend evolving in the present and in the future? Like,
I think it is a problem, especially for the men. For the women, less so, because you see, as you see with Fei Yu, they're also very empowered. and these are women with so many opportunities. So it's just about changing the traditional roles that are expected of them, and that's why I believe it was 2 years ago you had a campaign by a skincare brand, and it was called "Out to the Marriage Market" or something. I don't know if you remember that.
This one, right? By
yes.
SK2.
Yeah, SK2. It's a Japanese skincare brand. And it was about, the parents who go out to the marriage market to basically, promote their daughter, or their son, by the way. And it was these women telling their parents in that short documentary that they no longer wanted to feel this pressure and that they wanted to just be happy as they were. Yeah. So I think maybe it's not so much of a problem, but for the men it is a real problem because they cannot find the wives. And you see now that people are asking ridiculous bride prices, and I've also written about that in the past, that the bride price is it's a major problem because entire families have to save up in order to let their son be married because he has to pay such a high bride price fee. It's crazy.
Like a dowry?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know about that being such an issue, but especially since you mentioned that they're from rural areas, maybe don't have such access to higher income jobs, stuff like that, that would be even more troublesome, right? So on top of not being able to find women of
marriage age,
that kind of stuff, they're stuck economically, right? They can't even go to the other tier cities to find these kind of jobs to get the cash they need to do it. And on the other hand, you have women who, despite wanting something, maybe want to have a relationship, they're not gonna, marry down in a way, or settle for a partner who's lower status than them, right?
Yeah.
So, I can see how it's going to become an issue in China, especially considering the aging population, and some people have been saying, like, the root of the cause, as you mentioned, can be attributed mostly to the one-child policy, and when was it, like 2 years ago that the policy got lifted?
Yeah, I believe 2016. Yeah.
Became a two-child policy, right? And there's rumors that it could even be a three-child policy a few months ago. Have those rumors panned out or not?
I don't really know. I heard those rumors, but nothing big happened yet, so I'm not sure about that.
But I've heard some analysts claim that the two-child policy was done too little, too late, right? It might not be enough to solve the crisis we're seeing first in terms of lack of these leftover women and these leftover men, but also in terms of an aging population.
Yeah, also, but it also has to do with the rapidly changing economy, and I mean the two-child policy is especially, of course, targeted in urban areas because in more rural areas you already had people who could have a second child if their firstborn was a girl. But a lot of what you saw on Weibo at the time is that some people were happy, but there were also people who were unhappy because they were like, okay, now it is expected of me to get a second child, but I don't have the money for it. I already work so hard. So I really found that surprising because instead of thinking, oh, people will rejoice, people felt that that now their families and their parents-in-law might expect of them to have a second child, and they were like, we're not baby breeding machines. So very surprising reaction. I think it really showed that for a lot of people, 2 children are not even affordable or not even an option.
Economically, yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of like China is already entering into the problems that developed countries have, like Japan and some parts of the U.S., where birth rates are declining because, as we mentioned, economic reasons, right? Families can't support having more than 1 or 2 children, and it becomes an issue. And China is getting stuck in the middle of a number of problems, right? These leftover women, leftover men, economics, and aging population, and now also the inability to have even more children. So, it's going to be a tough couple of decades coming up.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to a slightly different topic, though. What was the perception of Me Too here in China from your perspective?
I think the Me Too movement in China was a little bit blown up by English language media. Yeah. There was some Me Too movement, especially in January of this year, 2018, but all that you have when it comes down to a certain alleged Me Too movement in China was related to overseas Chinese. So it always had a connection to America, either because there was an American somebody who lived in America used to study in Beijing, or always connections with the West. So there wasn't really, a real China-based Me Too movement. And if there was, then it was not really the same movement. It was all the time about academic oppression. Yeah. And it was not just about sexual oppression. It was also about, for example, boys being harassed by their female supervisors in academies. So academies or universities. So I think it was a very different kind of movement altogether. But it was just that a lot of Western media were very quick to label it as Me Too. Mm-hmm. So I found that a little bit troublesome, because I found, especially around March of this year, I was being called a lot by journalists who were asking me about where the Me Too movement in China. I was like, well, right now there is no Me Too movement in China, and they were like, that's because of censorship. But it was not necessarily the case. Mm-hmm. There were no women stepping forward in that way, unless they had some sort of relation with America.
Do you think that might have something to do with the cultural environment in China? Because here in China, how the way you progress in terms of your social life and even professionally is heavily based on what's called guangxi, or it could be like connections. How would you say guangxi?
Guangxi, yeah.
Connections and something like that. Yeah. So if you're seen, not just in this case, but in general, right? If you're seen as someone who kind of burns those guangxi bridges, or who stands out against other people, then it will negatively affect your future potential to move forward, right?
That could be, but also I think that feminism, for example, is also not the same in America as in China. There's just different issues that matter to people at this time, and there's not. I feel that in China it's more like a us too. For example, when there's about late last year, there was this big wave of abuses being exposed at kindergartens. Oh, yeah. Well, I would say that's sort of an us too movement. I found coverage of that actually more relevant in a way. It has nothing to do with being male or female or whatever. It's just injustice. And the same what you saw this year with a lot of academic injustice, boys committing suicide because they were pressured too much, girls also being sexually abused. So you've had these movements. It's just it's a different culture and it's a different background. Let's not forget that Me Too originally came from Hollywood. I mean, that was the Harvey Weinstein's issue. So it came from such a different background. That's why I wrote in my article at the time that you cannot have this cookie cutter approach to Me Too. Like, okay, you have this phenomenon. Okay, let's now see how it works in Korea, how it works in Russia. No, it's an American movement. It doesn't necessarily need to be the same movement in China. And why you need this movement at all in China? China can have different movements.
Their own movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's two parts about this. Like the first part, as you mentioned, was that I think Western media, they often look for they look for clicks in general, right? Not just clickbait articles, but they want to find the next wave, the next iteration of the news to keep the ball rolling in that sense, to keep attention, keep eyes on what's ever happening, what's trending, right? So maybe they were trying to look towards China to see what they could get from that, right? And on the other hand, sorry.
Yeah. Because I'm just thinking to myself, like, why did this annoy me so much at the time? Because it really did. It annoyed me, and now I'm thinking it's such a Western-centric way of thinking of things. Mm-hmm. I mean, if something happens in China, a big movement, we're not going on like, okay, so how is this movement in Europe going to develop? Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of a Western arrogance to think like the movement that you have here, of course it will move on to China because China needs that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm not sure it's Western arrogance.
Centric?
I might be. Some people think that way, like some groups maybe might think that way, but I think it's more of a social media phenomenon. Cause,
that's true, yeah.
Like the whole Me Too tag kind of started off on Twitter when what was the name of that woman?
Alyssa. Her name was Alyssa, I think.
Alyssa
Milano. Yeah.
She put on October 2015 on Twitter, if you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet. So I think it was more like a wave of women finally well, at least in the West, being able to express what happened to them without shame or repercussion, negative repercussion, I mean, right? And maybe people had, I'm just maybe projecting my own ideas onto it, but I think people were expecting it to be like, of course, why wouldn't China do it? But I don't want that to be like the focus. I think it's more like a social media in general phenomenon, right? The same as the Arab Spring, right? The democracy moving through social media like Facebook spread to these places where it hadn't been such, let's say, it wasn't the norm, right, to have those kind of ideals spread there. And this kind of idea, this concept, this meme, you could even say, was spreading throughout the world. So people were maybe perhaps shocked that it didn't work out in China in that sense.
Yeah.
So that's why maybe Weibo in a way is interesting as well, because there were reports of people trying to do the same thing on Weibo, but it was censored sometimes and sometimes not. Like, is it still censored, like those hashtags?
Actually, I haven't been checking out recently. I don't think so, because the last time I looked, they were also not censored. They were censored at a point when it spiked a little bit, not in January, but much later actually. But that's also because it's, of course, very much connected to the feminist movement and feminism, or any kind of political group that goes on Weibo and makes statements like that are often quickly to be controlled.
Well, like you said, we shouldn't be so quick to kind of imagine the global social media sphere as being one, right? There are definitely pockets or different groups of ways of thinking or operating which aren't controlled by, just Facebook or Twitter or something like that. So.
Oh yeah, let me give you one example, which I really liked, a story from 2016. Don't know if you remember the story I'm Fan Yusu, which is she was this migrant worker living in Beijing, and she wrote a short essay about her life as a migrant worker, and also being abused by her husband, and going through a lot of hardships. And that was a beautiful essay, and it went completely viral, and it resonated with so many people who had either the abuse, had experienced the same type of abuse, or had faced the same struggles when it comes to being a migrant worker in a big city, or different. There were so many different aspects in the story, and I see this. That was also a little movement in itself. It was a huge trending topic at the time. So it can also be not just through a hashtag, but it can be through a story like that.
Yeah.
Because at the time it was like I'm Fan Yusu. A lot of people said I'm Fan Yusu. So that's really like a Me Too in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting how, well, different trends spread differently throughout different parts of the world, and China, not just because of the language, because of the culture, has different ways of expressing those trends. So that's why what's on Weibo is so interesting to me, because seeing what your service does is it puts things in a unique perspective, where you not only have one view or two views, you have a different amount of views, right? You do a lot of research, right? You lay out different kinds of sources, and you really put things into perspective as things happening, not just at the moment, but how the trend got to that moment, right? Sometimes you even talk about where it could lead, right? Tell me more about like how you work to create that environment, like for what's on Weibo, like.
I start, you mean, or?
No, you have like a team of reporters, or?
Well, I do most of the work I do myself, but I have some really nice contributors who are very passionate about social media in China, and I'm very thankful to them, because a lot of social media in China, of course, is also done on WeChat. A lot of the important discussions. Most of the trending topics start on WeChat. But whereas Weibo is like this open living room and you can see everything, WeChat consists of all these small little rooms where people talk amongst each other.
Yeah.
So it's of course great to have contributors who can have their eyes in all those different rooms, and then you can catch a trend really early when they say, oh, this is an interesting topic. Then it starts on Weibo and it starts going bigger, and then we're already writing. So mostly I do it either in cooperation with my contributors, or they write something. Right now we only have 3 or 4 active contributors, so most of it I do myself. But what I love most is when we do it together. Like when the news comes in and you're like, oh, what do you think about this? And you become like little detectives going through the story, and that's what I find most interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like a small investigative journalism project, right? Like you can really focus the time and resources to check out what's going on underneath the stories and stuff like that. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Then what are some of the challenges you faced reporting on issues in China?
Well, I'm mostly, of course, I don't live in China anymore. I live in the Netherlands. And my website is based in the Netherlands. I'm a freelancer. I'm completely independent. So in that way, I don't have any challenges because I don't have to abide to any rules. But for the rest, challenges, not really, actually. Not really. I also, if there's a challenge, I'm willing to research it and see if I can do it anyway. Yeah.
Like for me, like one of the challenges I had as a journalist is sometimes maybe some of the sources will be wary to talk to me because maybe first of all I don't speak Chinese so well.
Well, that's a big challenge.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Number one. Yeah. And then I think when I try to speak to scientists for their scientific research and that kind of stuff, they're not so, I wouldn't say trusting, but they're just more careful when speaking to a foreigner, right? So I would usually have to get my colleagues to talk to them, that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah. Well, in that terms, if you're talking those types of challenges, what's difficult is I base, of course, my information on what's going on social media and in media and various sources, but you don't know anymore sometimes what media to trust. And I'm not just talking about Chinese media, I'm also foreign media and commenters. So that's why I try to give out my sources as transparent as possible, that people themselves can fact check. And instead of saying something is true, I rather say those and those media outlets report this and this, and you have conflicting stories. If there's conflicting stories, I'll just tell what the conflict is. So I see myself not so much as a journalist, but more as a China media watcher or a social media watcher. Yeah. And social trend watcher, so just hovering over as a helicopter.
But you do some interviews sometimes, right?
Yeah, sometimes. If I think it's interesting for our readers, then I do it. But mostly in a story, I never interview people for a particular story, news story. Then I just go about what people are saying online.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Then, since you've been in China for such a long time, 10 years now almost?
On and off, yes, yeah.
And you've seen this developing from the beginning of when the Olympics were here. You've seen basically how Chinese social media has developed from its infancy to where it is now, where it's a huge, behemoth, and it has a huge influence on not just within China nowadays, but increasingly outside of China. What has struck you as interesting? Like the differences between Chinese social media in general versus Western social media and those worlds? Like, what do you think are different about those two?
Oh, it's a little bit of a difficult question. What I do think is that, so lately there's been a discussion that I also addressed on my website about the word netizens and should we use, because people are always on and on about Chinese netizens. We don't really say, for example, Dutch netizens or American netizens, and why is that? And I was trying to think of reasons why that is, but I do feel that I see Weibo more as a little world than I see Facebook, for example, that is so polarized and so many isolated islands, that I do feel that people are more connected in a way, especially in discussions and around events. But of course, to start about why they are these social media platforms are all very, very different. Weibo, when it was launched in 2009, it was also it was launched by Sina. Of course, it's Sina Weibo, which is a media company. So it's not like Facebook, which really was a Facebook, like high school. This was, from the start, it was more of a media-based platform. So that is very different. Also, from the start, you had hundreds, right now I believe you have more than 30,000 government accounts on Weibo. So it was a media platform, it was a government platform, and that from the get-go is very different from Twitter or Facebook, for example. So that makes it interesting, but it also makes it very different. Yeah.
What I see happening, what I'm worried about in the West in terms of social media is that there's a lot of more and more people going into kind of like echo chambers, feeding off confirmation bias, right? So especially on Facebook, I'm off Facebook now. I don't use Facebook anymore ever since the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But all the data I've gotten from about Facebook since then has just told me that people, based on Facebook's algorithms as well, they're just content to get information, receive information, and be fed information that that they are agreeable towards, right? So let's say if I'm a liberal, I'll just take liberal information. That's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear about the other side's opinion, right? If I'm a conservative, same thing, just for the other side, right? And then so you have this kind of, let's say, split, not just split between two parties, but like saying islands forming, not just within the sites themselves, but within communities.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
And it's becoming more and more, not radicalized per se, but more and more extreme in some cases, right? Whereas in China, what I can see is that that's not such an issue. What do you think? Is it more homogenized in a sense, or is that still a problem?
Of course, because right now what you see in Europe or America or wherever, many other countries, is there's this big polarization between left and right. Are you pro-Brexit? Are you anti-Brexit? Do you like Trump? Do you hate Trump? And if you have a certain opinion about Trump, and for example, I say I like Trump, oh, then you're out of it, and then we're no longer Facebook friends. And of course, because China is such a different political situation, you don't have this type of polarization happening right now. Although you do have some discussions when it comes to feminism, for example, and about the liberal West that a lot of people don't like so much in China, the Bites War. So there are some interesting discussions on Weibo when Chinese people are commenting on what's happening with this polarization in the West. Yeah.
Can you explain a bit what is the Bites War to people who don't know what that is?
Yeah, there are
the white left.
The white left. Yeah. There is a movement of people who are quite anti-white left. Anti the white liberal, like the Women's March with Madonna and
Bernie Sanders kind of thing.
Yeah, and what was it again? There was, well, a little bit Me Too, of course, is also part of it. Anti-Trump movement. So you see a lot of this criticism about that, and that people actually applauded the rise of the right in Europe, which is so interesting in a way. I'm still trying to understand that, and it also ties together with a fear for halalification in China. People who are interested should just look that up. I won't talk about it here too much. It's a sensitive topic. Yeah.
I think maybe what you mentioned in terms of interest towards the rise of the right in Europe in China is that it's very tied to China's own perceptions of nationalism, right? And people kind of empathize in a way with what's going on in terms of that in Europe or in America.
You're right. And I think a lot of people in the beginning when Trump was elected applauded that on Weibo because they thought he was just a pragmatic business guy who was choosing America first. And a lot of people didn't see that as an insult. They were like, yeah, America first, China first. Yeah. Of course,
That's the way it should be.
So I found that entertaining in a way and interesting. It's definitely interesting, yeah.
Do you think that's... Well, we're not going to talk too much about the trade war, but do you think how is that changing with regards to the current political climate? Like, do you think people are changing their opinion? Is that...
I see opinions about trade. I don't know what to think anymore when I look on Chinese social media. It's going on and off. It's like some people find him very humorous, and some people find him a good businessman, and some say he's a fool, and it's just going on and off the whole time. And Trump is pretty unpredictable, and so is the attitude on what he does. It always depends. So I cannot say any. I think anyone who says, China thinks this and that about Trump it's not right in a way. Yeah.
There's too much to take in.
Oh, definitely. And also when you look at state media, things are changing, attitudes are changing. So no, let's say it's somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah.
For now, at least. Yeah. Okay. Another interesting thing that I've learned about China is that in the West, at least, we have something called doxing. Have you heard of doxing?
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, it's basically when a group of people online will, use search skills or maybe find a piece of information that someone has posted and link that or use their certain ways to find that person's personal information, right? And then maybe use that in ways to, intimidate them, or sometimes to even get them out of a job, China has something a little bit similar called the human flesh search engine, right? Tell us a bit more about that. Is that so different from doxing in the West, or?
I've not seen that many instances of doxing in the West as I've seen the human flesh search engine. So maybe that's already a difference. The human flesh search engine really is a collective effort of people addressing a social injustice, or something that they think is a social injustice, tracking that person down as a collective effort to get justice. So I think with doxing, I think, I'm not sure if you know of an example of what happened in the West, for example, but...
Well, I've known some cases where some people would help identify some threats, like a school shooter threat, for example, but it wouldn't be... I think the difference, based on what you've explained, is that the doxings are done by relatively smaller groups of people, so it wouldn't be like a huge mass of people, like it wouldn't be in China, right, where you... Like the way it happens, if I get it right, if I'm correct, is that... You get people saying, okay, have you heard about this person or the way this person looks? And they ask their networks and they spread it out among their friends to see who has anything. Yeah,
so they say the search engine is a real one made of flesh and blood. Yeah, that's why it's called the human flesh search engine. Yeah. And it actually started before 2009, before Weibo, when you had a woman who was crushing kitties with her high heels, and that was one of the first instances that people wanted to track her down. She was posting videos of that online. Terrible. And she was tracked down. Her name was published because if you do it with so many people, everybody will know someone who perhaps knows her. So you saw it in the beginning a lot. You saw it in the beginning a lot with when it comes to, for example, animal abuse. But then later on you saw it with a lot of things, and it's a little bit of a worrying trend, because lately you've also been seeing that journalists are being targeted, and also it's dangerous because people take the right in their own hands. If you look at a video, it's not always that straightforward. You don't always know how the situation is, so it is a very risky trend, I think.
That's why I was in a sense worried perhaps of the social credit system, right? Because it's not necessarily a human flesh search engine, but it perhaps could be used in that way, or all these systems could be linked in a certain sense, and who knows? We have to see what happens in the future to see whether that those mistakes need to be corrected or something needs to be changed to make it more safe. Because at least in the West, when certain instances like those arise, it doesn't always turn out right. The mob mentality isn't always the correct one when dealing with mob justice, right? Like in the West, there was recently a case of, I think it was in New York, there was a man who had gone to like a fast food chain, and he was being served by someone speaking in Spanish or something like that, or maybe it wasn't served by the server in Spanish, but it was like someone speaking Spanish, and he got angry. He was like, "What are you doing speaking Spanish in my country? You should speak English. It's America," right? And then within 24 hours, people had paused the video, done a similar kind of human flesh search engine kind of thing, but they had basically just doxed him using kind of like online recognition software.
Yeah.
And they found out who he was, where he worked, and what he was doing, and then they put, like, he was a lawyer apparently, and they put negative reviews on all of his services, so it probably tainted his business in the end. Right? So that kind of thing,
well, it's for life. It's for life, and in China, you've seen instances where, for example, one shopkeeper posted the photos of somebody who was stealing something in her shop, a young woman, I believe, and they used the human flesh search engine, and she later committed suicide.
Really?
Yeah, so that was a big issue. And also, for example, I don't know if you remember last year, the smiling reporter, or maybe it was this year.
It was the one who was taking like pictures with a car wreck.
She was taking a selfie, or maybe it was not even a selfie, but she was smiling, and she was actually reporting on a big car crash, and behind her you saw the chaotic scene of cars that were burned, and people had died, and she was laughing. And of course it's stupid, but the results of it is that she was fired, and that picture will always linger around, and that name will always be searchable. So for her to build up a new future with having all of that online is quite difficult. So yeah, it's very, very tricky.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So what do you think, what impact do you think that not just Weibo, but China's social media sphere will have in globally in the future? Like, because what we see now, there's some, like for example, on sites like Reddit, you know Reddit, there's some people claiming that there's like this so-called Wu Mao army. People pay like 5 cents per post to support certain policies or certain things on the news in favor of certain people, right?
Yeah.
What about like people who aren't part of that? What about just people, regular Weibo users and people who use WeChat? How do you think that's going to influence the global social media sphere in the coming 10?
For now, I think Chinese social media is very China-focused.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Chinese social media users are very focused on China when it comes to the news.
Mm-hmm.
So for now, I don't think, well, the impact, of course, is technology, because China is, if it's not already the technological leader, it is becoming that. So we're going to use in the Netherlands or in France or wherever, we're going to use more and more Chinese products. So I think that what you see with platforms such as Weibo or WeChat being these super platforms where you can hail your ride and you can pay for your e-commerce, I think in that perspective it will have more of an influence on us. Politically, I don't believe. Well, I don't see in.
Okay. What about plans for what's on Weibo? Like, what are you planning for the future? What's the next step?
Oh yeah. So now after 4 years, firstly, I'm just very happy that the site has grown into the site that it's grown into now, with so many readers per month, and it's being a well visited website, and I'm very grateful for that. What I would really like is to write a book and to go further into these issues of digital developments and social trends, because I don't see it changing, or I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. So I'm just looking forward to keep on researching and actually basically to keep doing what I'm doing. Yeah.
You said previously that you had put your PhD on pause to focus on what's on Weibo.
Yeah.
Do you have plans to continue it? And what is your PhD on?
Well, actually, my PhD was about representations of the Second Sino-Japanese War in popular culture, both in China and in Japan, because that was actually, I graduated both in China studies and Japan studies, so I always hoped that, that was my major topic, but then this came along. So that's why that topic, I will no longer focus on that, because now this is more of my topic. So who knows that I can still do my PhD, but do it about Weibo and not about war. And who knows, maybe, because still Sino-Japanese relations are an important topic on social media as well. So who knows, I can find a middle way.
Yeah, with all the resources you have, based on previous articles and stuff, it would be you already have a lot of the legwork done, in a sense, if you plan to change your PhD focus for that.
Yeah, we'll see.
Okay, and what about like in future topics that you plan to write about for what's on Weibo, and any trends you see coming on? You mentioned one of your previous articles just recently was about the technological conference in Hong Kong. Was it RISE?
Yeah, it was RISE, the biggest tech conference in Asia. I visited in Hong Kong. What I think is because tech I was never such a tech girl or anything, but now I think that tech is just becoming such a huge part of our lives. It's no longer, that you can actually no longer say you're not interested in technology, because it's part of everything you do.
Necessary.
Yeah. So I think, and the bigger trends that you saw during that conference, which I think are bigger trends in general, is the growing importance of AI, the growing importance of big data, and of course this social credit system, and in general the role of China, rising China as a digital leader. These are all things that I will cover in the time to come, and they all go together, because I'm sure that this growing implementation of AI across cities will also come with interesting new topics.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
and I think definitely technology is one of the things that's gonna, based on what I asked you before about how maybe the social media sphere in China will influence global social media spheres. I think currently the main barrier is language, right? But within the next, I don't know, I don't know too much about it, but I think probably within 10 years, if I'm being generous, we probably have enough, good enough translation software that it wouldn't be a problem for people to communicate between each other, right? and including AI and so on. Some of the topics I'm interested in, especially concerns AI, right, and how that's going to impact the labor force, right? It's already been happening for the past couple of decades. Automation has been shrinking the job market in terms of low wage and low skilled jobs, right, in China. But in the future, AI is bound to take over and even replace medium skilled jobs or high skilled jobs, right? In the future, maybe there could be a robot doing what I'm doing now, So, what's your take on AI as developing in China?
Yeah, I think it will make a lot of things more effective. For example, now with the helmets that they're producing, they're testing out with helmets that monitor people's brainwaves, so whether it's in factories or in hospitals or in transport, people driving, and they can know when people are tired, when they're agitated, when they need a break. So, and already it's proven very effective because they can very effectively plan, for example, when people need a pause, when people need to, when the productivity goes down. So, a lot of focus, of course, obviously, is on the gloomy and the darker side of AI, but I think there's also surely a side that will make transport or hospitals or wherever, factories, safer workplaces.
Right.
I'd like to focus on that side as well.
You're more of an optimist.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay. Well, and final questions. I know you gotta leave soon,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
You got another interview coming up. Okay. What are the topics that you think the Westerners right now are most interested in seeing, based on your website, based on your experience?
Oh God! Well, people in general are just interested if there's a topic that is really going viral in China, then people in the West in many countries also are interested in. And by the way, many of my readers also come from Vietnam, Philippines. So from there as well, I see that there's great interest in these kind of topics. But for example, some time ago, there was a big topic on Chinese social media about a pregnant woman who tripped a little boy while he walked out of a restaurant because he annoyed her before and he had hit something in her face, by coincidence, and not on purpose. But it is often the small stories like that that get really big, and I see that many people from around the world find these kinds of stories interesting because it's about certain moral questions.
Human interest stories.
It's human interest, like why would a pregnant woman trip over a little boy or kick a little boy? And
that's another story that was interesting. There was a man. Well, it was like a child going back from school on a bus, and he was just bored.
Oh God, yes.
He was kicking a passenger, and the third kick, he just got annoyed enough to just stomp him onto the ground, like the man to the child. So that's something that people were.
Well, I mean, if that was a very shocking story to see, like an adult man hit a child in that kind of way was horrible. Yeah. But I think if you see that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are talking about it on Weibo, then people in other countries, of course, will find it interesting. It's just that they have no way to get through to Weibo because of the language barrier, the registration barriers, and everything. And of course, that's why I do what I do. So I hope to continue doing that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing what you do, and I'm a big fan of your work and your sites, and I look forward to keeping reading on there. And it's great having you, and good luck with your other interview and endeavors. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Before we finish, do you want to give our audience like a plug to where they can find you? You're on whatsonweibo.com.
Yeah, whatsonweibo.com. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and I'm also vlogging a lot on YouTube, so please follow us there. Oh, sorry. You can find me on whatsonweibo.com. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and lately also we've been doing quite some videos, so don't forget to follow us on YouTube, please.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah.